The Golden Oak restaurant, nestled in the heart of downtown New York, stood as an oasis of opulence, attracting those who sought a taste of the city's finest luxury. The atmosphere was steeped in sophistication, with soft music playing in the background and the faint clink of crystal glasses accompanying the quiet hum of polite conversation. Above, the glimmer of crystal chandeliers illuminated the polished marble floors, casting a warm, golden glow across the patrons. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant evening gowns sat at tables draped in pristine white cloths, enjoying their lavish meals in a world apart from the hustle and bustle of the city outside. Into this meticulously crafted world, a man walked through the restaurant's doors, a man whose appearance immediately set him apart from the elegant crowd. In his late 60s, his clothes were worn and faded, a far cry from the sleek suits and expensive dresses around him. His shirt was frayed at the collar, his shoes scuffed from years of use, and his face bore the marks of a life spent outside the comfort of privilege. As he entered, the soft murmurs of conversation faltered, and a palpable tension swept through the room. All eyes turned toward him, their gazes lingering on the stark contrast he presented to the high-end patrons around him. He didn't belong here, they thought. This was a place for the wealthy, the important. A place where appearances mattered, and his appearance, quite frankly, was a jarring disruption. The man, however, seemed unaffected by the attention. He stood for a moment at the threshold, his eyes scanning the room with quiet curiosity. He made no effort to rush or to apologize for his intrusion. Instead, he simply walked further into the restaurant, as if taking in the beauty of the space. His presence, unassuming as it was, seemed to shift the very air in the room. The guests returned to their meals, but the discomfort lingered, like a silent question left unanswered. How could someone like him be here? At the front, Sarah, the young hostess, had been trained to welcome the exclusive clientele of the Golden Oak with a smile, to guide them to their seats with a practiced grace. But as her eyes fell on the man standing in the doorway, she immediately stiffened. His presence was out of place, and that alone made her uneasy. She didn't need to know anything more about him. His worn clothing told her everything she needed to know. He didn't belong here. With a thinly veiled sneer, Sarah approached the man. Her voice was polite, but there was an edge of disdain in her tone. "Good evening, sir. May I help you?" Her words carried an unspoken assumption that he was there by mistake, that someone had let him in without realizing he was unworthy of such an establishment. The man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he glanced at her briefly before looking around the room, taking in the grandeur of the restaurant. He made no attempt to explain himself, nor did he seem particularly concerned with the way he was being treated. His silence only seemed to provoke Sarah further. "You don't have a reservation, do you?" she continued, her voice growing more insistent. "I'm afraid we can't accommodate you." She looked at him expectantly, waiting for him to leave, but the man remained standing, as if considering his options. Without a word, he took a slow step forward, entering the restaurant and silently surveying the surroundings. His presence was a quiet rebellion against the assumption that only certain people had the right to enjoy the luxuries of places like this. Sarah, flustered and irritated by his refusal to leave, glanced back at the waiting area, as if hoping someone would come to deal with the situation more effectively. Nathan, the restaurant's manager, was a man who prided himself on his ability to control the environment of the Golden Oak. He had spent years maintaining its impeccable reputation, and his role in ensuring that everything ran smoothly was one he took seriously. When he noticed Sarah standing by the entrance, her face tense and her movements stiff, he knew something was amiss. As he approached, he caught sight of the elderly man, still standing at the center of the room, his presence somehow growing more uncomfortable with each passing moment. Nathan's gaze flicked over the man, and immediately he understood what was happening. The stranger, with his worn clothing and inconspicuous demeanor, did not belong. Nathan had no tolerance for interruptions to the restaurant's carefully curated atmosphere. His face hardened as he took in the situation. "Sarah, ask him to leave," Nathan said coolly, his voice a sharp command. There was no room for debate in his tone, no second thought. The man didn't belong here, and Nathan wasn't about to let anyone disrupt the restaurant's exclusivity. He turned his attention to the elderly man, his gaze dismissive. "I'm sorry, but this isn't the place for you," Nathan said, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension only someone who had spent too long in the world of privilege could muster. "This is a private establishment, and we don't accommodate people who don't belong here." As Nathan spoke, the tension in the room seemed to intensify. The other guests, already uncomfortable by the presence of the man, now watched the scene unfold in hushed silence. Nathan's words hung in the air, thick with disdain. The elderly man remained calm, his face unflinching. He didn't rise to the challenge. He didn't argue. He simply continued to stand there, unperturbed. And as the room waited for the inevitable conflict to unfold, there was a sense of unease that settled in, a quiet understanding that something wasn't quite right. From a table near the back of the room, Olivia watched the scene unfold. She had noticed the man as soon as he entered, her eyes lingering on him for a moment before returning to her meal. Olivia had always felt a quiet dissonance with the world of high society. She was no stranger to it, but she had been raised with different values rooted in kindness and empathy. She believed that respect should be given to all people, no matter their social standing, their appearance, or their wealth. As the confrontation between the elderly man and Nathan escalated, Olivia could no longer stay silent. Rising from her seat, she walked toward the front of the restaurant, her steps purposeful, her eyes fixed on Nathan. When she reached him, she didn't hesitate to speak. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but firm, her gaze unwavering. "What are you doing? Judging this man simply because of the way he looks? Is that really how you run this restaurant? By excluding people who don't meet your arbitrary standards?" Nathan was momentarily taken aback by her boldness. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of other guests. He opened his mouth to respond, but Olivia continued, her voice growing stronger. "This restaurant was built on values of respect and hospitality. But right now, you're showing none of that. If the Golden Oak is meant to be a place of excellence, then kindness should be the standard, not elitism." Her words seemed to hang in the air, each syllable cutting through the tension that had thickened around them. The other guests, who had been watching in silence, began to murmur in agreement. But Nathan, too proud to back down, simply glared at Olivia, dismissing her words as naive. "You don't understand how things work here," he snapped, his voice cold. "This is a fine establishment. We can't just let anyone walk in off the street." Olivia's eyes narrowed. "I understand perfectly, and I think you don't understand the responsibility that comes with running a place like this." With that, she turned away from Nathan and walked back toward her table. The murmurs of approval from nearby patrons were enough to make Nathan realize that his grip on the situation was slipping. The golden veneer of exclusivity that he had worked so hard to maintain was beginning to crack. As the elderly man bent down to pick up his fallen bag, the quiet sound of something clinking to the floor caught everyone's attention. It was a small notebook and a weathered photograph, both of which had slipped from the bag unnoticed. The photograph, though old and worn, was still clearly visible. A young man standing proudly in front of the Golden Oak, a confident smile on his face. The familiar setting of the restaurant was instantly recognizable. And as Nathan leaned down to pick up the photo, something strange stirred within him. He stared at the young man in the photograph for a long moment before his eyes widened in sudden recognition. The man in the photograph was none other than Thomas Bennett, one of the original founders of the Golden Oak, the very same man who stood before him now. Nathan's stomach sank. He had been treating the man standing in front of him, his restaurant's founder, with disdain, oblivious to his true identity. The realization hit him like a cold wave. His own arrogance had blinded him to the significance of the man he had been so quick to dismiss. The elderly man, Thomas Bennett, looked up at Nathan for a brief moment, a faint glimmer of recognition in his eyes. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Before he left, Thomas Bennett turned to face Nathan once more. His voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that resonated through the stillness of the room. "A great tree doesn't need to prove its strength by crushing the grass beneath it," he said softly, his gaze steady and knowing. The words hung in the air, their meaning clear but unspoken. Nathan's face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't respond. Thomas didn't wait for him to speak. Instead, he turned and made his way toward the door, leaving Nathan standing there, rooted to the spot, as the rest of the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Just as the door closed behind Thomas Bennett, Nathan stood motionless, his mind racing. The silence in the room was deafening. The weight of the old man's words, the recognition of his face, the slow-burning realization of the situation. It all came crashing down on Nathan in a rush of dread. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, the heat of embarrassment rising in his chest. He had just dismissed the very man who had built this restaurant, the foundation upon which Nathan had built his career. Before Nathan could gather his thoughts, the phone at the front desk rang, breaking the oppressive silence. It was a call from the concierge, who spoke with the kind of urgency that Nathan didn't often hear in his line of work. "A very important guest is about to arrive, sir," the voice on the other end said. "We need to prepare the staff immediately." Nathan, trying to regain some semblance of control, straightened up and nodded briskly, even though his mind was still tangled in confusion and guilt. He quickly instructed Sarah to make sure the staff was on alert. "Prepare the best table. Be ready for anything," he said, his voice shaking slightly. Within minutes, the heavy front doors of the restaurant opened once more, this time with the unmistakable presence of a man whose stature demanded attention. A man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped in, accompanied by none other than Thomas Bennett himself. Richard Bennett. Nathan's heart sank further as he saw the older man's son enter. Richard Bennett was a towering figure in the culinary world, an icon. But it was the realization of who Richard was with that caused Nathan's world to tilt on its axis. Richard Bennett wasn't just any prestigious guest. He was the heir to the Golden Oak, and the elderly man at his side was the very founder, the man who had started it all. Richard walked up to Nathan, his expression one of quiet authority. "Nathan," he said, his voice calm but heavy with implication. "This is my father, Thomas. You probably don't remember him, but I'm sure you've heard of him." Nathan stood frozen, his mouth dry. 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind, but he couldn't form a single coherent sentence. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. Richard smiled, though it was laced with disappointment. "You see, Nathan," he continued, his voice steady, "this restaurant, the Golden Oak, was founded by my father decades ago. He poured his life into building it, starting from nothing. He didn't do it by shutting people out based on their clothes or their wealth. No. He did it with humility, with respect, and with the belief that everyone should have a seat at the table, no matter who they were." Nathan's face flushed with a deep crimson. He had always prided himself on upholding the reputation of the Golden Oak, but in that moment, he realized he had missed the very essence of what the restaurant stood for. All the years he had spent cultivating exclusivity, ensuring that only the wealthy and prestigious dined there, he had misjudged it all. Thomas Bennett, the man who had started it all, stood by quietly, his face unreadable, but not angry. Nathan couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze, and his shoulders sagged under the pressure. Richard, sensing Nathan's growing discomfort, gestured toward the dining area. "Let's sit," he said, his tone still firm but measured. "We have much to discuss." As they sat down, Richard began to share the story of the Golden Oak's humble beginnings. It was a far cry from the polished, upscale image the restaurant now projected. Richard spoke of the early days when his father had struggled to make ends meet, when the restaurant had been little more than a modest diner. He spoke of the long hours his father had spent working, not for the luxury of the food, but to create a place where anyone, rich or poor, could come and experience the joy of a good meal, a place where everyone was treated with kindness and respect. Richard's voice softened as he recalled how Thomas Bennett had always believed that success was not about wealth or status, but about the relationships one built with others. "My father built this place not for the elite, but for the people," Richard explained, his gaze moving between Nathan and his father. He believed that greatness could be achieved by staying grounded and treating every person with dignity. Nathan felt small as Richard spoke, as if the very foundation of everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. For years, he had operated under the misguided notion that the Golden Oak was a sanctuary for the privileged, a place that kept the undesirables out. But in his zeal to maintain this image, He had forgotten the principles that had originally driven its creation. Richard paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Nathan. "You've forgotten what this restaurant is about," he said quietly. "You've allowed the culture here to become one of exclusion rather than inclusion, and I can't stand by and let that continue." Nathan opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. How could he justify what he had done? The reality of the situation, the truth that had been laid bare before him, was undeniable. "Where do we go from here?" Nathan asked, his voice barely audible. Richard turned to his father, who nodded slightly. "We start over. We return to our roots, and we make sure that the Golden Oak is a place for everyone, no matter their background. That's the legacy I want to carry forward." He turned back to Nathan. "I'm afraid that won't include you, though. I'm dismissing you from your position as manager." The words hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. He felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. His career, his identity, all of it crumbling away in a single moment. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, he stood up slowly, the weight of his disgrace pressing down on him with every step. As the night progressed, the truth continued to unfold in ways Nathan hadn't anticipated. Unbeknownst to him, the restaurant's security footage from earlier in the evening had been quietly reviewed by Richard and Thomas. The footage clearly showed Nathan's interaction with the elderly man, his dismissal of Thomas as if he were an outsider, a mere nuisance. It was an uncomfortable sight for everyone who saw it, and the staff began to feel the weight of their complicity in fostering an environment of elitism. The restaurant's loyal employees, many of whom had worked for years under Nathan's management, began to realize that they, too, had contributed to the toxic atmosphere that had pervaded the Golden Oak. They had stood by and watched as people were turned away based on their appearance, as those who didn't fit the mold were treated with disdain. The realization hit them hard. What had once been a respected establishment was now a symbol of exclusion. The murmurs of disapproval began to circulate among the guests who had witnessed the events unfold. The atmosphere of the restaurant shifted, and it became clear that a change was needed, a profound, transformative shift that would redefine the very soul of the Golden Oak. Later that evening, Richard Bennett stood before the gathered staff, Thomas by his side. The room was heavy with the weight of what had transpired, but Richard's voice rang out with a quiet authority. "Nathan's actions today have shown us all something important," Richard began, his tone firm. "The Golden Oak was never meant to be a place of exclusion. It was founded on principles of humility, kindness, and service to everyone, no matter their background. These are the values that will guide us moving forward." He turned to face Nathan, who had been standing near the back of the room, his head bowed in shame. "I'm afraid your time here is over," Richard said simply, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "The Golden Oak will no longer tolerate discrimination, and we will no longer operate with the kind of elitism you have fostered. It's time for you to go." Nathan stood still, his body trembling as the reality of the situation settled in. He had been a part of the Golden Oak for years, but in that moment, he understood that he had lost everything: the trust, the respect, and the position he had once held so proudly. As Nathan left the restaurant, Richard and Thomas stood together, their eyes focused on the future. The staff, feeling a renewed sense of purpose, rallied around them. The Golden Oak would rise from the ashes of its past, embracing the values that had once made it great: kindness, respect, and inclusivity. That evening, as the last of the guests left, Richard stood at the front of the restaurant, gazing out over the empty tables. "We're going to make this place what it was always meant to be," he said softly. "A place where everyone, regardless of who they are, can feel welcome. That's the legacy we'll carry forward." And with that promise, the Golden Oak began its rebirth. The next few weeks at the Golden Oak were unlike any in its storied history. The echoes of past mistakes still lingered in the air, but something new was unfolding. Richard Bennett, with his father by his side, worked tirelessly to reshape the heart of the restaurant, to restore its soul. Gone were the days of exclusivity, of turning people away based on appearances or wealth. Instead, the restaurant became a symbol of openness, welcoming all who walked through its doors with dignity and respect. The staff, once divided, rallied together with a shared sense of purpose. Sarah, the young hostess who had once sneered at Thomas Bennett, became one of the restaurant's most devoted advocates for change. She took the time to learn about the legacy of the Golden Oak, of the values that had originally shaped it. Each day, she greeted guests with a warmth that had been missing for so long. The Golden Oak was reborn, not just in its physical space, but in the very essence of what it represented. It became a place where the rich could dine next to the poor, where the suits of Wall Street mingled with the work-worn clothes of a blue-collar worker, all treated with the same care and respect. It was a place where stories were shared, where laughter echoed off the walls, and where the simple act of sharing a meal became a reminder of what truly mattered. And for Thomas Bennett, it was the fulfillment of a dream he had held onto for decades. He had built the Golden Oak not for the few, but for the many. To see it thrive once again, to see it reflect the values he had always cherished, brought him a quiet satisfaction that no amount of wealth or success could ever surpass. Richard, standing at the front of the restaurant one evening as the sun dipped below the skyline of New York, looked out over the bustling dining room. He watched as people of all walks of life came together, united by something greater than just food. He knew his father had never sought recognition for his contributions, but Richard felt that it was time for the world to understand the truth. The Golden Oak wasn't just a restaurant. It was a legacy of humility, compassion, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserved a seat at the table. As the evening wore on and the last guests filed out, Richard turned to his father, who stood beside him, smiling. "We did it, Dad," Richard said softly. "We really did it." Thomas nodded, his eyes filled with pride and love. "No, Richard, we didn't just restore a restaurant. We restored a dream, and that's something no one can ever take away from us." And as the lights of the Golden Oak dimmed for the night, it was clear to everyone who had been a part of its transformation. The true wealth of the Golden Oak was not in the prices of its meals, but in the hearts of the people it had touched. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. We hope you enjoyed the journey through the Golden Oak and the transformation of its legacy. Your support means the world to us, and we're thrilled to have shared this experience with you. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more exciting tales, and share it with your friends and family. Your feedback and support help us grow and bring even more captivating stories your way. Thank you again for being part of this amazing adventure. We look forward to sharing many more stories with you soon. Thank you for watching. Please note, this video was generated using AI technology to read the story. While we strive for accuracy and clarity, there may be some occasional errors or mispronunciations. We kindly ask for your understanding and patience if any mistakes occur. If you notice any issues or areas for improvement, please feel free to leave a comment below. Your feedback is invaluable and will help us enhance the quality of our future videos. We appreciate your support and engagement. Thank you for being part of our community. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. And we'll see you in the next video.